Hello and welcome to Scenic Painting 101, brought to you from my garage by L.A. Pierce College and COVID-19. Today I'm going to show you two basic scenic painting techniques and how you can use those techniques to paint something like this rustic gate. The first technique is wet blending, which we'll use to lay in our base coat and to define the position of our boards on our gate. The other technique I'll show you is called dry brushing, which is what we use to define the grain of the wood. Along the way, I'll also show you an easy way to paint some knots, and then we'll finish up the project with a little bit of highlight and shadow. So let's get started. The first step of almost any painting job is to lay down a priming coat. This should be a color close to your base color. Since in this project the base is actually a blend of three colors, I used my middle color here as the primer. So I want to lay out where my fence battens go. Normally you would measure this out to make sure everything's nice and square and even, but I'm just eyeballing it here for this demo. Alright, I'm ready to start laying in my colors. I'm going to start with my darkest first. So what we're trying to simulate here is boards of a fence. So you're going to want this paint here to go all the way top to bottom, as though we're kind of delineating separate boards. When you do a pattern here, you don't want to make it look like a circus tent where it's even stripes. So you want to have it some kind of a random pattern to the way you do it. Okay, I'm going to start working in my middle color now. Kind of get it on there. And then start blending it in. The hardest part of a wet blend is usually keeping it all wet as you work. You need to work fast enough so that it doesn't dry out on you. This is fortunately a small project, so it's pretty easy to get this all blended before it dries out. Okay, that's about all I want to do on that. I want to keep some definition. Depending on the project, you might want to blend it more or less. Alright, I'm going to work in some light. I want my fence to be a little bit lighter up on the top. So I'm going to kind of just let this paint here sort of peter out as it goes down. Also, I don't want to do a lot in my dark areas here and sort of spoil the darkening that I've done. So I just put a little bit of that on there. You can blend it out with your metal brush. That's good enough. Now this is going to be covered up with the graining, so you don't need to be too careful about the way you do this. You want to get a nice blend, but you don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it. Alright, now you're going to lay out your blending on your battens. I think I'm going to start with a little light here. So you notice how I use the end of the brush to define my line. If you try painting like this, it's hard to make the brush get all the way, it's hard to push the paint all the way to the edge of the line. The paint naturally flows out to the edge of the bristles. So when you're cutting in lines like that, what you want to do is use the bristles of your brush to cut the line. makes sense here. Do this diagonal board first. Because its ends are cut off by the horizontals. So you want to finish with the horizontals. So that you have that line going across there like that. I'm getting a lot of dark to light in these boards here, which is a little extreme. Okay, good. Alright, so now we want to let this dry. I'm going to go ahead and wash out my paint brushes, and we'll come back to this later. Now that my base is completely dry, I'm ready to dry brush in the grain. So first I'm going to mask off my frame boards, and I'm just going to reuse the masking tape that I used before. You can usually use a piece of masking tape over and over again for at least 4 or 5 times before it loses its stickiness or gets so wet that you can't use it anymore. Dry brushing is actually easier if you have an old paintbrush with splayed out bristles. So I have a brush here that I used for applying some chemical stripper to some furniture that I was refinishing. And you'll notice how the bristles on it are all rough and splayed out as opposed to this new brush where they're a little tighter. So what you want ideally is something like this, or an old worn out brush. The other thing about it is you want to water down your paint so that it flows really easily. If it's too thick, it won't flow and give you a nice, smooth grain. So normally when you paint, you dip your brush in your paint, take it out, and you rub your brush on one side of your pail or cup or whatever you're using. For dry brushing, you want to get out more paint than that, so you probably will rub off both sides. It's also a good idea to have a piece of scrap wood handy so you can sort of see whether you're getting enough of a grain. So this looks pretty good to me, so I'm going to go ahead and continue here. Generally, you want to keep it to straight lines. If you want to do a little wiggles in there, you can. It's kind of add some interest to it, but don't go overboard on that. If you want to put some knots in the wood, you can dip your thumb or a finger in the paint and just twist it around like that. Maybe just put a few in random spots. I wouldn't overdo it. Maybe 3 or 4 is enough. And continue with the dry brushing. Okay, now I need to let this dry before I can do my highlight. Alright, now that that's dry, I'm going to add in my highlight grain. I'm using this little fan brush here. And I'm going to do just some little weird shapes around some of these knots. The wood around a knot always tends to be kind of unpredictable in the grain form that it takes. So some of them you'll just do something like that. But most of them, they'll have some other kind of weird sort of swoopy shapes around that they take. Go ahead and do those. Continue. You notice if you tip the brush on its side, you tend to get sort of heavy. So it's best to just keep it flat as much as you can, but sometimes if you're going around a knot, you need to tip it a little bit. So after we lay in our highlight, we're going to go ahead and do these boards, but we want to let that dry first so that we can move our masking tapes out to the side there. So I'm going to go ahead and wash my brushes and take another brush. Alright, this is dry, so I'm going to go ahead and do my battens. I'll just move my tape out here to make it a little easier. Diagonal first. I always like to have a damp rag when I paint, so you can clean up edges or drips. It's a little heavy. Okay. Let's go ahead and put a little knot in right here. Maybe another little one right there. Oops. Some highlights here. Okay, we're almost finished here. We're just going to do some highlight and shadow and a little bit of touching up around some of these knots that I got a little crazy with the highlight there. Take my base, middle, tone that down a little bit. Okay. And I'm gonna clean up those knot shapes. Okay. Alright, so I have some real thin paint here. Black paint and water. I'm going to do a shadow line under these batten boards using a liner stick to guide my brush. This is where you're straightening out any irregularities in your wet blend and your dry brushing. Just touching it up with your shadow. And I'm going to use a little narrower brush here. I'm going to run some vertical lines. Delineate fence boards. Make sure that none of these lines run through a knot when I place them. The stick looks like it's curved, but it's actually a straight stick. It's the wide angle lens on my camera that makes it look like a curve. Highlight. It's okay if it's not a totally even straight line. It looks actually better usually if it's a little bit broken up. Usually I try to do my highlights on the side of the piece that's going to be facing towards center stage, since generally the center of the stage is going to be the brightest part of the stage. So if you don't know specifically how the lights are going to be in a show, it's a safe bet that you can highlight towards the center. Extra at the top. And last but not least, I'm just going to add some cracks in on my knots. Not all knots have cracks, but a lot of them do. And just kind of clean up a little bit on some of them. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed watching this demonstration, and I hope you'll try it yourself. Even if you don't have the right colors of paint, just use whatever you've got available. As long as you've got something dark and something light, you'll probably come up with an interesting effect. Wet blending is something that you'll use all the time in the theater, and dry brushing is handy not only for wood grain effects, but also for creating a linen or rough fabric effect by cross-hatching your brush strokes. We also use dry brushing just to add age to a prop. Thanks for watching.